I was in the bath at the time, and my wife answered the telephone and established that it was Hilda, and then came to me and said that Hilda seemed especially anxious to talk to me. And I spoke to her for something like 30 minutes. And at the end of that conversation, she said something to me which remained in my mind. And it was words to the effect, if they don't get me first, I want the world to know that at least one old woman has seen through their lies.
Hilda Murrell made that call on February the 25th, 1984. 4 weeks later, a year ago this month, 78-year-old Miss Murrell was murdered by an intruder in her home. The long investigation by Shrewsbury Police has reached the firm conclusion that the killer was an ordinary burglar looking for cash and that things went tragically wrong. But detectives investigating the crime also know there's evidence which points towards two quite different and disturbing explanations for Hilda Murrell's death. Miss Murrell's nephew is retired naval commander turned Thatcher Rob Green. He believes his aunt was killed by someone looking for a paper she was writing opposing the nuclear industry. But Labour MP Tam Dalyell says he has reliable information that Miss Murrell was the last victim of the Falklands War.
I believe that people imagined that Commander Rob Green, her nephew, with a key position in the Falklands War, had deposited Belgrano-related intercepted signals in his aunt's house, and it went catastrophically and tragically wrong.
Someone was looking for those documents and was surprised.
And was surprised by this gutful, courageous, 78-year-old Edwardian woman returning unexpectedly.
World in Action's inquiries into the death of Hilda Murrell have uncovered new information which may assist the police in their hunt for her killer. Tonight we reconstruct the known events of her violent death, using actors where necessary and actual witnesses where possible. We do so with the cooperation of the police, her friends and close family. This rose is called Hilda Murrell, developed as a tribute to one of the most distinguished horticulturalists of her generation. When Miss Murrell retired from her professional career in 1970, she sold her famous nursery to television gardener Percy Thrower. With more time to herself, Hilda Murrell turned her talents to opposing the use of nuclear power. Her friends and family regarded her views as a natural result of her concern for the environment.
She had a passionate love for the British countryside and wildlife, and she was very expert at it. She devoted the last years of her life to this. She saw pollution of the environment as being a new and very dangerous problem, and that the nuclear industry were producing the worst of all pollutants.
Miss Murrell's opposition to nuclear power extended to nuclear weapons, and she made her views known in both campaigns.
She would write letters to her local newspaper and to either the Times or the Guardian, which were the two newspapers that she was reading at about that time. As she gained confidence and knowledge through the beginning of the 80s, she began to write more directly and in more detail. Several times actually got her letters through to ministers who had to deal with them.
In 1982, Miss Murrell turned her attention to the plan to build a new American-designed nuclear power station at Sizewell in Suffolk. She decided to prepare a paper criticising the cost and safety of the project and to present it herself at the public inquiry. This extraordinary undertaking by a 78-year-old woman was encouraged by the head of a Europe-wide environmental lobby, Gerard Morgan Grenville.
Well, I think her paper was a remarkable one because she had spent her life growing roses. And although she was held in great esteem as being an exceptionally intelligent person, she only started to study nuclear physics and the whole of the nuclear industry well into her retirement. And for one person in that situation to be able to see so transparently through all that had gone on in that industry and what is still going on was really remarkable.
Hilda Murrell worked on her paper in the kitchen of her home in Shrewsbury, and by autumn 1983 it was well on the way to completion. Her concern about nuclear weapons also grew, and in October she decided to travel to London for a demonstration against cruise missiles. Before setting out, she sent her Sizewell papers to her nephew, asking him to make sure they got to the inquiry should anything happen to her. Did it occur to you that she might have been threatened at that time?
I suppose for the first time it did raise in our minds the possibility that she was taking that sort of thing seriously.
Hilda Murrell lived on her own and didn't have a regular routine. On Wednesday, March the 21st, however, she had a lunch appointment outside Shrewsbury made on the telephone the previous weekend. Anyone seeing her leave home around 11 o'clock may have assumed she was going to lunch. In fact, she was going shopping. Shortly after she'd left home, a neighbour saw a man in his 30s, dressed in grey, jump over the wall of a nearby house and head towards Miss Murrell's home. A red escort car, which has never been accounted for, was seen driving past the house. Just after midday, Miss Murrell's white Renault came back up Sutton Road and turned into the drive of her house. It's been widely assumed that the intruder was in the house and may have heard the car stop on the gravel drive. But he didn't leave, and police accept this is most unusual for an ordinary burglar.
Well, we would have expected most people to have avoided a confrontation, but it's difficult to know how people react in these circumstances. And what we believe happened in this case is that the man either panicked or decided to take the action that he did for reasons which are not entirely known. It is most unusual, yes.
I speculate that it's because perhaps he hadn't finished what he had to do, or that he felt he might be able to conceal himself for long enough, knowing that she was still going to go to lunch and she would go away again and leave him to complete his job.
Certainly the intruder had time to get away if he wanted to. Instead of going straight indoors, Miss Murrell crossed the road to pay a neighbour for a raffle ticket that she'd agreed to buy. No one knows for sure what Hilda Murrell found inside her house when she returned minutes later, but at some point she encountered an intruder.
I could imagine that she would have said, "You can take anything you want of my valuables," and if they showed the slightest sign of not wanting to, then she would have very quickly jumped to the conclusion that they were after her papers, and it would have been her anti-nuclear papers. She once said that if she was ever burgled, that she would not fight over her possessions, but she would fight over her papers. I believe that was entirely characteristic, and that I think she would be absolutely fearless, and she would have fought like a cat.
Instead of leaving Miss Murrell to make a getaway, the intruder decided to take her from the house and put her in the passenger seat of her own car.
I just find it quite incredible that a simple burglar going for cash would have gone to the enormous risk of abducting her. I just speculate that he couldn't risk just clearing off, leaving her to tell the world, that no doubt he didn't have the authority in any way to kill her, and so he was left with a dilemma whereby he had to maintain control of her while perhaps getting higher authority or advice on what to do next.
Doesn't it seem absolutely extraordinary that an ordinary burglar would take the occupant from the house? Why on earth would he do that?
It really is most unusual, and we don't really have any proper explanation for that. As I say, I can only assume that he either panicked or that he'd got reasons which only he would know about. We genuinely don't know.
If the car had turned right, it would have reached the safety of open countryside within less than a mile. Instead, it turned left towards Shrewsbury town centre. At a roundabout among heavy midday traffic, the intruder took the exit marked towards the town centre. The car was being driven wildly, and there were over 60 sightings, many witnesses reporting a woman slumped in the passenger seat. Driving in this erratic manner, detectives believe the car actually went past the police station before heading out into open country.
I'm driven to believe that he wanted to go along that route for some other reason which was overriding, that he may well have been trying to get to a rendezvous where perhaps he had an accomplice who had his transport, and that rendezvous was somewhere along that route.
Only the intruder knows what happened next, but the car skidded into a ditch and got stuck in mud in a narrow lane at Hormond Hill. The police believe that Miss Murrell was then taken from her car and frog-marched or carried 400 yards across an open field in the middle of the day towards a wood where her body was found 3 days later.
I think the distance is so great that the chances of him getting away with carrying her across there without being seen are very small, bearing in mind it was the lunch hour on a fine day in an area which was known to have a lot of casual visitors because it was something of a beauty spot.
That afternoon, 27 witnesses saw a man wearing everyday clothes and muddy training shoes running from the direction of Hormond Hill. It's a 6-mile journey back into Shrewsbury, and the last sighting was within 400 yards of the local police station. Meanwhile, the crashed white Renault was first seen abandoned at 1:10. At 4:30, 2 teenagers found it unlocked and stole the tax disc. They've told us that there were papers lying on the back seat. The police say when they saw the car, there were none. A local farmer, John Marsh, decided that the car looked suspicious and reported it to the police at 5:20.
It's fair to say that so far as the officers who went to the scene there, they saw nothing which would have aroused their suspicions that there'd been any criminal act committed there.
And yet it was suspicious enough for the farmer to report it and think it was suspicious.
He had quite correctly, yes, drawn it to our attention, yes.
And he regarded it as suspicious?
I believe he did, yes. Unusual, I think it's fair to say, yes.
Because it didn't have a tax disc and it appeared to have crashed in the side of the road.
The fact that it was at the side of the road was, I think, the reason that he'd drawn it to our attention, yes.
2 days later, on Friday the 23rd, the same farmer again reported the abandoned car. This time, the officer who'd examined it visited Miss Murrell's home. It was late evening, the door was open and the house empty, but he thought nothing suspicious. Next morning, another policeman called. The door was ajar, and he searched the whole house, but even he didn't raise the alarm. He locked the back door. But 1 hour later, Miss Murrell's gardener, David Williams, and neighbour, Brian George, came to an instant and different conclusion.
We went in through the conservatory door. We noticed the normal shopping bag in the hall, and then we continued into the scullery where we observed washing on the floor, seed packets littered around the place. We found a couple of bags, handbags on the table. There were other things, paperwork, general mail on the table. And then we proceeded through into the front part of the hall. On reaching that, we observed at least 3 days' mail on the hall floor. Any layman would recognize instantly there was something seriously wrong, and it appeared that a burglary had taken place.
Miss Murrell's body was found in this wood at 10:25 on that Saturday morning, nearly 3 days after she was abducted. She'd been beaten and stabbed, but had eventually died of hypothermia. She was naked from the waist down. Her skirt lay nearby, her shoes in a field 50 yards away. The police believe she died in the wood where the body was found. But her nephew, Rob Green, believes Miss Murrell was originally dumped in a ditch much nearer the road where her hat, glasses and a knife were later found. And there's evidence that he may be right. The day after the murder, on Thursday the 22nd, a farm worker had seen a dark saloon car draw up several times and eventually park in a gateway near the ditch. A man got out and walked towards the wood, passing the spot where Commander Green believes his aunt was lying. He returned 15 minutes later. Also that afternoon, a red escort car was twice seen again, cruising past the scene. That same afternoon, the farmer, Ian Scott, went into the wood where police say Miss Murrell was already lying dead. He was checking every tree for felling. Mr. Scott is unwilling to appear on television, but says that if the body had been in the position it was later found, he would have fallen over it. He would have noticed a dead rabbit, he told us, let alone a dead woman. But why have you come to the conclusion that Mr. Scott is wrong?
Well, we haven't come to the conclusion that Mr. Scott is wrong. What I believe may have happened is that he might not have just seen the body where it lay. The clothing, in fact, was she was wearing a brown coat, and it would to some extent merge into the background. Additionally, of course, where the body was found, there was a slight hollow.
But isn't it rather more likely that she was in fact just thrown over the fence or something of that sort and left and moved much later?
Well, we don't believe that is so, and certainly the pathologist who performed the examination afterwards subscribes to the view that Miss Murrell died at the scene where she was found.
Is he absolutely certain of that?
As I understand it, he is, yes.
But the pathologist is not certain. Dr. Ackland believes there are two possible ways that the body could have been moved into the woods.
She could have been moved straight away after death, when features such as hypostasis hasn't fully developed. If she was moved after this feature had developed, then it presents great difficulties, and I think it would require two people to move her with great care and replace her exactly as she was positioned.
But it is hypothetically possible?
It's hypothetically possible, yes, I can agree with that.
So Rob Green may be right, and the killer may have returned to make sure his aunt was dead and move her body. And he believes that this is the action of someone who needed to be sure she could never reveal that he was no ordinary burglar.
Perhaps the assailant did not know whether she was dead or not when he left her, so they needed to confirm that she was dead. And then, possibly, to have considered confusing the trail in some way, because the car, of course, was sitting there waiting to be reported and to be followed up, so that was a very risky situation.
Back at Miss Murrell's house that Saturday morning, Brian George tried to summon the police by telephone. He discovered that 4 wires were disconnected, so that anyone calling in would hear a normal ringing tone, but the phone in the house was cut off.
It was a little bit on the professional side, or shall I say, for someone to take the actual lid off the junction box and take out very carefully the 4 leads that were going to the junction box from the phone.
What is your view of the significance of the disconnected telephone?
Well, we don't attach any greater significance to it other than the fact that it was clearly yanked from the connecting box. And this, again, there is nothing unusual about this. It's quite a normal method employed by burglars in case they are, in fact, disturbed.
I think my knowledge of that particular side of the industry would instantly prove that they'd either been snatched or taken out. In this case, they were really taken out.
Mr. George also tried to telephone Miss Murrell's second home in the Welsh borders. The phone was out of order. A police statement claimed that the capacitor had been damaged by a storm. But later, a British telecom engineer approached a member of the local police authority with a different story.
Here again, he said that the police account was somewhat not in accordance with the facts as he knew them. The police account was that there had been storm damage to one of the capacitors. He said that this normally happens as a result of lightning. And he said that lightning was not very common in March, and his recollections are that there was no lightning in March of 1984. The same fault can be produced by hitting the equipment with something heavy, and damaging it in that way.
Suffice to say, I am satisfied that it was not due to human interference.
And so you see no significance in the fact that both of Hilda Murrell's telephones were out of order at the same time when she was being burgled?
I see no significance in this phone at the second home being out of order, no.
I've always wondered how it was that the intruder chose that day to break into the house. And I understand that that was her only social engagement for that week. Therefore, I'm led to believe that in some way maybe her telephone was tapped. Hilda was suspicious that her telephone was tapped and therefore was very discreet over the phone, especially talking about her paper.
Has part of the police inquiry been to question whether Miss Murrell's telephone was tapped before the burglary?
We have no information to suggest that her telephone would have been tapped.
Has part of the inquiry been to find out whether it had been? As you know,
we've
a
had
number
no
of
need
people
to do so.
A number of people's telephones are tapped, particularly when they are campaigning in the way that she was.
All right, may I say that this is the first time that this particular suggestion has been made, yet another theory, and certainly we have no information to suggest that her telephone was tapped, apart from what you are now suggesting. I don't know where you get the information from, for example.
I have no information that it was.
So it's just another theory?
I merely ask if you have asked the question whether her telephone was tapped.
No, we've not. We've not.
Police discovered that less than £50 in cash had been stolen from the house, but no other valuables removed. another thing detectives don't regard as odd.
Well, burglars differ in what they take and what they don't take. Some go for cash and others go for more valuable items. We believe in this instance it was a search for cash.
Is there any evidence that any papers or anything of that sort were taken?
Well, we have no indication that they were taken from the house. The papers, in fact, were still in the house there.
Hasn't it been suggested that there was a later draft than that which was found?
Well, it may have been suggested, but we have no evidence to confirm that there was, in fact, a later draft.
But there is evidence. This is the version of Miss Murrell's Sizewell paper as police found it in her house. It had been typed for her 2 months earlier, and there are no alterations on it. But there is evidence that Miss Murrell continued to work on the paper right up to her death. We've seen a copy of her personal diary, and on March the 20th, the day before she died, she recorded, "Started polishing and correcting paper. Eliminated 16 lines from the first 6 pages. Not enough, though." Police agree that no copy of the document found at the house has anything crossed out or deleted. It seems fair to assume, therefore, that the copy that Miss Murrell was working on was taken away. What is your view about a possible connection with the Sizewell inquiry?
We rule it out.
Why do you do that?
We have no further information to indicate that there was a motive there.
In his spare time from his job as a thatcher in Dorset, Rob Green completed his Aunt Sizewell paper and presented it on her behalf at the inquiry. Since her death, he's been investigating a possible link with her anti-nuclear views. But Rob Green hasn't always been a thatcher. Until October 1982, he was a commander in Royal Navy Intelligence and personal advisor to the Commander-in-Chief, Sir John Fieldhouse. Working at Navy headquarters at Northwood, Commander Green played a key role in analysing signals and information in the Falklands War. Only last December did he have cause to link the death of his aunt with his own career.
I'm informed that the intruders were not after money, were not after nuclear information, but were checking the house to see if there were any Belgrano-related documents of Commander Green in the home of his aunt. Things went disastrously wrong.
Labour MP Tam Diel has been given this information by 2 confidential sources, which he says have proved reliable in the past.
They were rummaging around to get information. Incidentally, I better say clearly to you that I don't think that Commander Green had done anything wrong, and certainly not put Falklands-related documents in the house of his aunt in Shrewsbury. But of course, at that time, ministers were, to borrow a phrase from the Ponting trial, jumping up and down. The Prime Minister was going berserk about leaks, and there were demands here, there, and everywhere to try and trace the source of Belgrano-related leaks.
I certainly did not leave any documents for my aunt. I wouldn't have done anything so irresponsible and so stupid. I was too fond of her to expose her to a risk like that. I did feel, on reading his statement carefully in Hansard, he wouldn't have gone to all that trouble without some good justification. And I've tried to remain objective throughout this unpleasant affair, and so I felt I had to look at it and consider it as a possibility.
Throughout our inquiries, Commander Green has refused to discuss any aspect of his role in the Falklands War. But we've learned a number of details which cast light on why he may have come under official scrutiny. Towards the end of 1981, the Royal Navy was facing a battle with the politicians who wanted to axe 1/3 of the surface fleet. One of the casualties was to be the Endurance, the South Atlantic patrol ship which kept an eye on British interests around the Falklands. In January 1982, the ship began signalling a hostile mood in the Argentine Navy and unusual ship movements. At the Ministry of Defence, these messages were dismissed as part of a campaign to retain the Endurance and were largely ignored. At Northwood, the messages were taken seriously. Put together with other fragments of information, Naval Intelligence warned the Ministry of Defence that the withdrawal of Endurance would be a green light to Argentina already preparing to invade. These warnings were never acknowledged by the Franks Committee report into the causes of the war. One of these officers whose warnings went unheeded was Commander Rob Green. Even as the task force sailed, they believed that the war could have been avoided. Green had planned to leave the Navy well before the war broke out, and soon after it finished, he did so. In the months that followed, the Defence Ministry became increasingly concerned about who was leaking secret information about the war to Tamdiel. Can you understand why you might have been somebody on whom suspicion would have fallen?
I suppose so, that I was one of a relatively small number who knew about the operation. I find it hard that my aunt should have been investigated like that. I would have expected myself to be investigated.
We've been told that Green was investigated, and so were others in his position. One is Lieutenant Commander Peter Hurst, who was an operations officer at Fleet Intelligence during the Falklands War and has also retired. He now has a sensitive job with British Aerospace and has declined to be interviewed. But 1 week before Christmas, his flat in St Albans was burgled. Although it contained valuables including solid gold cufflinks, 2 hi-fis, video recorders and televisions, nothing was stolen except some bottles of spirits. Lieutenant Commander Hurst believes his telephone has been tapped and that he's been under surveillance by security forces. We've also learned that another officer doing high-security work at Northwood and living in lodgings nearby believes his belongings were searched. 2 hold doors left secure in a cupboard had been opened. So have you also ruled out a connection with the Falklands War?
I think it's fair to say that we never felt very strongly about any connection with the Falklands War, and it is also very fair to say that we've had no facts at all to take us down that particular line.
There is the fact that Hilda Murrell's nephew was a senior intelligence officer in the Royal Navy at the time.
Yes, that's a very tenuous fact if you're trying to link that with her murder, but certainly there's no dispute that in fact he was in the Royal Navy, yes.
Whether Hilda Murrell was killed for what she owned or for what she might have known, her murderer left many confusing clues. In their search for the man in this identikit, police have taken over 2,000 statements, made 12,000 house-to-house inquiries, checked over 8,000 vehicles and have 22,000 index cards of information. 1 year after the crime, detectives working in the case remain optimistic of an early arrest. This afternoon, West Mercia Police appointed a senior officer from Northumbria Force to look into all aspects of their investigation of the Hilda Murrell case.